Welcome to the deep dive. You know, when most of us think about beekeeping, especially German beekeeping, we get this really warm, cozy picture, don't we?
Absolutely. It's all about tradition, this gentle craft.
Yeah, like wooden hives, maybe a field full of flowers, that dedicated local beekeeper.
Yeah.
It feels very artisanal, very stable.
It's a lovely image, but honestly, when you dig into the economics, it's deeply misleading.
That's leading how?
Because that very cultural heritage, the thing everyone romanticizes, it's actually at the heart of what our sources are calling a structural crisis in German beekeeping.
Crisis. But Germany's known for its bee research, right?
Oh.
It's not like they don't understand bees.
But they absolutely do. They've got world-class science. This isn't about a lack of knowledge. It's a fundamental clash, a structural conflict between preserving that deep cultural tradition, which is often embedded in regulations, and frankly, the tough realities of needing modern economic scale to survive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the material we've looked at is just fascinating and pretty uncomfortable reading sometimes. It really lays out this detailed analysis pitting Germany's super traditional model against these like hyper-commercialized approaches you see elsewhere.
Places like New Zealand, the US, very different worlds.
Totally. And it's like an X-ray showing how these regulations, which were set up with the best intentions, guaranteeing quality.
Like that famous German honey quality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How those good intentions can actually become huge roadblocks for anyone trying to make a real living, trying to professionalize.
We've really gone through quite a bit. Internal government reports, critiques of the German Beekeepers Association, the DIB, hard data on why colonies are failing, even escalating conflicts with environmental groups.
So the mission for this deep dive, what we really want to get to the bottom of for you, the listener, is this question. How can a country with so much expertise, top-notch research institutions,
World class, really.
how can it struggle so badly to professionalize an industry that's actually crucial for its entire agricultural system? I mean, pollination.
Right. Vital. Absolutely vital.
So our goal today is to give you the full picture. Why is it so hard to scale up in German beekeeping? How does that focus on premium quality paradoxically hold back commercial success? And crucially, what specific reforms, and these look politically tricky, might actually be needed to make this sector profitable and sustainable in the long run?
We're definitely moving past that idyllic meadow image today.
Straight into the economics, the regulations, the biology, the real structural stuff.
Right. So to really get a handle on this structural problem, you have to start with one absolutely defining statistic. It sets the stage for everything else.
Okay.
The structure of German beekeeping is just overwhelmingly dominated by hobbyists. As of 2024, the estimates put the total number of beekeepers somewhere around 170,000 across the country.
170,000 beekeepers. Managing how many colonies?
They manage a combined total of about 1.14 million colonies, or Welker, as they say in Brown.
Okay, 1.14 million colonies.
Right.
On the surface, that sounds pretty healthy, right?
Yeah.
A big national asset, lots of bees.
It sounds like it, yeah. But here's the twist. You're arguing that having so many beekeepers is actually the core of the problem, not a sign of strength.
Exactly. The issue isn't the total number of bees. It's the incredibly small scale of the average operation.
Ah, okay.
When you look at the data, especially within the main association, the DIB, the German Beekeepers Association, the average member manages just about 6.8 colonies, 6.8 hives per person.
Yeah, 6 or 7 hives, and let's be honest, by any economic standard, managing 6.8 hives isn't a job, it's a hobby.
Right. It's something you do on the weekend. It's not paying the bills.
Precisely. It generates practically zero taxable income, certainly not a primary income. It's a passion project, a leisure activity. Maybe you sell a few jars to neighbors.
And because that scale is so tiny, it means the vast majority of those 170,000 people who collectively manage most of the country's bees, they're basically shielded from any real economic pressure.
That's the crux of it. Their livelihood doesn't hinge on whether they get a good honey harvest or not.
So if, say, 90% or more of the sector isn't relying on honey sales to pay rent or buy groceries,
then there's virtually zero internal pressure to professionalize. Why would there be?
they don't need strict business plans. They don't necessarily need to invest time and money in the absolute latest, most precise scientific methods for disease control.
Or worry about complex risk management strategies. The sources we looked at estimate that the share of colonies managed truly professionally and professionally usually means you need at least, say, 150 colonies just to start making a viable income.
150 compared to 6.8, that's a huge jump.
Massive difference. And the estimate is that these professional operations manage well under 10% of Germany's total colonies, maybe even closer to 5% in reality.
Wow. So if the professional segment is that tiny, then it feels like the whole system, the rules, the training programs, how honey is priced, the association's focus, it must all naturally gravitate towards supporting the needs and interests of those 160,000 hobbyists.
That's exactly what happens. It creates a system that, maybe unintentionally, makes life really difficult for anyone trying to operate at scale.
It creates inertia, as the sources call it.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Look, a professional beekeeper has to think like a manufacturer almost. A biological manufacturer managing maybe 200, 300, 500 colonies efficiently just to hit profitability targets, especially with rising costs.
That requires totally different equipment, different logistics, moving hives around.
Yeah.
A completely different mindset than someone checking their 6 backyard hives on a Saturday.
Absolutely. And because the hobbyists are the overwhelming majority, they dictate the regulatory climate, the cultural norms, the training priorities, and that environment is often fundamentally opposed to the kind of large-scale efficiency a professional needs.
Okay, so if scale is key to profitability, we need to look at where that actually happens. Let's bring in that contrast you mentioned earlier. New Zealand, how does their structure compare?
Oh, the contrast is dramatic. It really highlights the extremes. New Zealand actually has fewer total colonies than Germany, around 500,000, maybe 0.54 million registered.
Fewer bees overall.
Fewer bees, but look at who manages them. In New Zealand, commercial beekeepers, and they define commercial pretty broadly as anyone with over 50 hives, these commercial guys account for roughly 94% of all the colonies in the country.
94% commercial dominance in New Zealand versus less than 10%, maybe much less in Germany.
Yeah. Oh, it's a staggering difference. A structural chasm, really.
So New Zealand is basically an industry, while Germany is largely a craft or hobby.
That's a fair way to put it. New Zealand beekeeping is heavily driven by export markets, especially high-value products like Manuka honey, which fetches incredible prices.
Right. That stuff is expensive.
Very. And that high value justifies huge investments in efficiency, in mobile operations, in rigorous science-based management. Their whole system is geared towards supporting scale and export.
So the NZ model proves scale can work, it can drive profitability, but back in Germany, the hobbyist structure just holds everything back. Like you said, if I'm an accountant with 6 hives.
Why would you invest thousands in advanced diagnostic tools?
Yeah.
Why would you switch to a more complicated, maybe more effective, but more labor-intensive Varroa treatment method just because some research institute says so, if your current way feels good enough for your hobby?
You probably wouldn't.
Exactly. And that's the self-reinforcing cycle. Hobbyists can absorb a bad year, lower yields, even colony losses because it's not their main income. It's a passion.
It can afford to be less efficient, stick with older methods passed down in the local club.
Whereas the professional cannot afford inefficiency. But they're stuck operating in a system, rules, training, culture that's built for the amateur. That's why the sources conclude Germany's structure creates this deep-seated inertia, resisting the move towards modern industrial standards needed for real competitiveness. What's fascinating here is how deeply embedded this is.
And that inertia, it's not just cultural drift, it's actually kind of codified, institutionalized, right? Which brings us squarely to the German Beekeepers Association, the DIB.
Yeah, the DIB is central to this whole story.
Our sources describe it almost as a paradox. On one hand, it's the guardian of tradition. On the other, it acts as a major innovation brake. Some even call it a cultural regulatory trap.
That's a strong term, but you can see why they use it. The DIB is incredibly successful at its main goal, ensuring the quality and trustworthiness of the Echterdeutscher Honig trademark. That brand is gold standard. Consumers trust it implicitly, and it commands a premium price.
Everyone recognizes that label, that specific jar.
Absolutely. But, and this is the crucial but, maintaining that gold standard requires rules, very strict rules, that are fundamentally at odds with running a large-scale, efficient, modern beekeeping business.
So the very thing that protects the quality also hinders growth.
Exactly. The protectionism, which works brilliantly for the small-scale seller, becomes almost suffocating for anyone trying to scale up.
Okay, let's get specific. What are the biggest barriers baked into the DIB system? The sources seem to highlight 2 main ones. Let's start with the quality standard itself. particularly around freshness, measured by this chemical, HMF.
Right, HMS stands for hydroxymethylfurfural. It's a key chemical marker. Basically, it forms when fructose, the main sugar in honey, degrades.
And that degradation happens with heat or just over time.
Both. It speeds up significantly with heat exposure and as the honey ages. So a high HMF level is a red flag. It tells you the honey might be old or it got too hot during processing or storage.
And the DIB standard for HMF is?
Incredibly strict. The maximum allowed HMF content for honey sold under the Echterdeutscher Honig label is just 15 milligrams per kilogram. 15.
Okay, 15 milligram kilograms. Why is that number such a problem for scalability? How does it compare internationally?
Well, it's significantly tougher than the general European standard. The EU typically allows up to 40 milligrams, sometimes a bit more depending on the honey type.
Wow, 15 versus 40, that's a huge difference.
It is. Now, that 15 milligram a kilogram guarantees exceptional freshness. As a consumer, you know that honey has been handled minimally, gently, and it's probably quite recently harvested. That's the upside.
But the downside for a large producer?
It creates massive logistical headaches. Think about how large operations work. They need efficiency. One key efficiency is batch homogenization, pooling honey from hundreds of hives, maybe harvested over several weeks.
Okay, mixing large batches together.
Right. But if you're mixing batches, maybe some slightly older, some newer, you risk raising the average HMF across the whole lot. A single slightly older batch could push the entire tank over that tight 15 milligram limit.
And the other issue is heating, right? Honey crystallizes.
Exactly. Honey naturally crystallizes, especially certain types, making it thick and hard to bottle cleanly and quickly. Large operations often use very controlled, brief, gentle heating, sometimes called flash heating or thermal treatment, just to reliquefy it enough for filtering and efficient bottling lines.
Seems reasonable for efficiency.
It is. Standard practice globally. But even that short, controlled heat pulse can be enough to nudge the HMF content up, potentially pushing it over the 15 milligram threshold.
So the DIB's super strict HMF standard effectively blocks two cornerstones of industrial efficiency: mixing large batches over time and using even minimal heat for bottling.
Pretty much. It locks beekeepers into this small batch, handle it super gently, get it sold quickly model, perfect for direct regional sales. But if you're trying to supply supermarkets or export, needing large volumes and consistent processing year-round, that 15 milligram limit is a major hurdle. It acts less like quality control and more like a hard cap on operational size.
Okay, that's barrier one. Barrier two, which reinforces this trap, is the packaging itself. The famous DIB honey glass.
Ah, yes, the Einheitsglas. It's iconic, instantly recognizable. That standard 500-gram jar, 405 milliliter volume, with the specific DIB tamper-proof seal. It's a masterclass in building consumer trust. You see that jar, you know what you're getting.
Solid branding. Why is it a problem for professionals? Can't they just use that jar?
They can, but it severely limits their options in the modern marketplace. Think about dealing with a big supermarket chain or an exporter looking to sell German honey in Asia.
They might want different sizes, different branding.
Exactly. Retailers need flexibility. Maybe they want a smaller 250-gram jar for a specific price point, or a 1-kilo plastic squeezy bottle for families, or a uniquely shaped glass jar to stand out on the shelf with their own store brand. The DIB glass is strictly one size fits all. No variations allowed if you want that trademark.
So if a professional wants to get into major retail channels, they often need to use what the industry calls neutral glass, generic jars they can customize.
Right. Neutral glass allows them to use different sizes, different shapes, apply their own labels, meet the specific requirements of large buyers. But the moment they switch to neutral glass,
they lose the DIB trademark. They lose that instant recognition of quality and trust built up over decades.
It's a terrible catch-22. Either stick with the standardized, maybe inefficient DIB glass that limits your market access and logistical options, or give up your most powerful marketing tool for German honey quality and try to build consumer trust from scratch with a generic-looking product.
Plus, sticking to one jar type probably makes bottling lines less flexible too, right? If you're set up only for the DIB glass.
Yeah, that's another point sources raise. Professional bottling plants are designed for quick changeovers between different jar sizes and types. Being locked into one single format can actually increase overheads for professional bottlers who serve multiple clients, making it less efficient overall.
And the DIB doesn't mess around with enforcing these rules, does it?
No, they're very serious. The sources mention penalties for misuse, like using the wrong jar or exceeding the HMF limit, but still using the trademark penalties can go up to 20,000 euros. Or they can just revoke your right to use the trademark entirely.
Ouch. That's a big stick. Makes experimentation pretty risky for a business.
Absolutely. You're not going to risk that kind of fine or losing the brand. So the conclusion from the analysis is pretty stark. The DIB, while brilliant at protecting the traditional regional hobbyist model and its associated quality image, effectively acts as a barrier, not a facilitator, for anyone aiming for scalable, high-volume, potentially export-oriented professional beekeeping. It protects the past at the expense of the future, in a way.
Yeah.
So we've got this structure built for hobbyists and regulations that kind of lock that in place. But maybe the deepest, most tragic irony in this whole situation is the knowledge problem.
How so?
Because Germany actually has world-leading expertise. You mentioned LAVES Celle earlier, the Lower Saxony State Office for Consumer Protection and Food Safety's Institute for Apiculture. It's internationally renowned. Cutting-edge research happens there.
Right, they're the brains of the operation, developing best practices, doing the science.
Exactly. But despite having this incredible institutional competence, the average quality of bee management across the country, especially among the hobbyists who dominate, is often worryingly low. This gap is where the real trouble starts.
And LAVES Celle isn't just research, right? They're also involved in training.
Crucially, yes. LAVES Celle houses the only specialized vocational school for professional beekeeping in all of Germany. This is where they train the Tierwirt, specializing in apiculture.
Tierwirt, that's like a certified animal technician, but specifically for bees.
Precisely. And this isn't just a weekend course or a certificate. It's a rigorous, state-recognized 3-year apprenticeship. You're talking intensive study of bee diseases, pathology, advanced breeding science, managing hundreds or thousands of colonies, logistics, business economics. It's the absolute gold standard of professional bee expertise, recognized globally.
Okay, so the top-level training is excellent, world-class even.
Unquestionably.
But the problem is getting that expertise out to the masses.
It's a massive bottleneck. The number of fully qualified Tierwirt graduating each year is, as one source put it, vanishingly small compared to the 170,000 people actually keeping bees.
So you had this tiny pool of incredibly well-trained professionals, and then this huge ocean of hobbyists operating largely outside that high-level scientific framework.
Exactly. The knowledge exists in the institution, but the pipeline to get that precise, up-to-date knowledge effectively into the field to the average beekeeper, it's fundamentally broken.
And this broken pipeline leads directly to what the LAVES consultants themselves call the problem of learned errors.
Yes, this critique is sharp and comes from people working within the system, like Guido Eef, one of the LAVES consultants. He gives these talks, sometimes quite bluntly, to beekeeping associations.
And his message isn't comfortable, I gather.
Not at all. He basically says high colony losses, especially over winter, are frequently not due to mysterious, unavoidable factors like pesticides or climate alone, although those play a role, but are often the direct result of fundamental, basic, avoidable management mistakes.
Mistakes the beekeepers are making themselves.
Yes. And his famous line, which sums it up perfectly, is Gut gelernt und falsch gemacht. Gelernte Fehler sind die schlimmsten.
Well learned and wrongly done. Learned errors are the worst. What does he mean by learned errors?
He means beekeepers are often diligently following procedures they were taught, procedures they believe are correct because that's how they learned it, maybe from a mentor or in a local club course. But the procedures themselves are outdated, imprecise, or just plain wrong according to current science, especially when it comes to the biggest killer, the Varroa mite.
Varroa. Always Varroa.
It's still enemy number one, responsible for the vast majority of losses. And Ike points to specific failures in how it's managed. The first big one is just core visual diagnosis.
What does that look like?
A typical hobbyist might quickly glance into a hive, see bees flying in and out, maybe check honey stores and think, yep, looks okay. Move on.
Seems reasonable.
Each argues it's totally insufficient. They miss the subtle early warning signs of a colony under stress, especially from viruses transmitted by Varroa. Signs like, well, damaged brood caps, maybe tiny holes or sunken caps. Or seeing bees removing dead or diseased larvae, that hygienic behavior is a sign the colony is fighting something. Maybe even seeing bees with deformed wings, a classic sign of deformed wing virus, which Varroa spreads.
So they're missing the smoke before the fire really breaks out because they haven't been trained what specifically to look for.
Exactly. They lack that diagnostic precision. Which leads to the second failure, a general lack of scientific rigor in assessment. Ish really hammers this point, the need for proper tools. He talks about death determination.
Morbid, but important.
Very. When a colony dies, especially over winter, a hobbyist might just shrug, blame the weather, and clean out the box. A trained tierwart, however, would perform a basic autopsy. Use a magnifying glass, tweezers, maybe take samples. They'd meticulously examine the dead bees, the position of the cluster, the remaining food stores, look for signs of nosema spores, check Varroa levels on the dead bees.
A proper investigation to learn what went wrong.
Right. Without that systematic forensic diagnosis, you can't figure out the actual cause of death. And if you don't know why they died, you're doomed to repeat the same management errors next year. You haven't learned anything.
Okay, poor visual diagnosis, lack of forensic rigor. What's the third failure?
Sticking to outdated or inefficient treatment methods, tradition often trumps science here. Many rely on simple, maybe easier acid treatments like formic or oxalic acid, but they might apply them at the wrong time of year or not accurately measure the dose or use methods that don't effectively reach the mites hidden under brood caps.
So doing something but not the right thing, or not doing it effectively enough.
Precisely. Meanwhile, LAVES and the scientific community promote more integrated pest management strategies, sometimes involving more intensive techniques like partial brood removal or even total brood elimination, TBE, at specific times.
TBE, total brood elimination. That sounds drastic.
It is quite drastic, yes. It involves removing all the capped brood from the hive temporarily. This eliminates the vast majority of Varroa mites, as that's where they reproduce. It's highly effective, resets the mite population to near zero, giving the colony a clean start, but
It's a lot of work.
and feels disruptive.
Exactly. It's labor-intensive, requires precise timing, and many hobbyists resist it because it seems unnatural or too harsh on the bees, or, frankly, just too much hassle for their 6 hives. They prefer the familiar, easier, but ultimately less effective traditional methods.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If LAVES knows the best science, and the tierwart are trained in it, why do these learned errors persist so widely across the whole community? Why isn't the better knowledge spreading?
That's the core transmission problem. It's baked into the DIB's structure again. Remember, who trains the vast majority of those 170,000 beekeepers?
Not the handful of tierwart, it's local clubs, right? Volunteer mentors. Exactly. Most new beekeepers learn from volunteer multipliers, experienced members in their local association, maybe a bee godfather, Pate, people who are passionate and dedicated, absolutely, but their knowledge is often based on decades of local tradition and personal experience, not necessarily on the latest rigorous scientific findings coming out of LAVES Celle every year.
So the old, possibly error-prone methods get passed down generation after generation within these local networks.
Yes. And because you learn it from a trusted local figure, it gets validated. It becomes the way we do things around here. This creates a massive, widespread validation problem for scientifically proven, but perhaps newer or demanding methods. LEDs can publish all the research papers it wants, but breaking through that entrenched local teaching is incredibly difficult.
And this loops back to the scale issue again, doesn't it? Because small scale also means less investment in helpful technology.
Absolutely. It creates a significant technology gap. Around the world, professional beekeepers managing hundreds or thousands of hives are increasingly using technology. Remote hive monitoring systems, for instance, things like Broodminder or other systems that use sensors inside the hive.
What goes track?
Things like hive weight, which tells you about honey stores and consumption, internal temperature, humidity, even acoustic sensors listening to the bees buzz.
Wow. Data-driven beekeeping.
Exactly. This data gives the professional early warnings about potential problems like starvation, disease outbreaks, or swarm preparations. It allows them to manage vast numbers of hives much more efficiently, targeting interventions only where needed.
Makes sense for managing 500 hives scattered across the countryside.
Totally essential. But for the average German hobbyist, the Kleinstbetrieb with their 6.8 colonies, investing hundreds or thousands of euros in this kind of tech, it's just not economically rational.
So they're stuck relying on those traditional manual visual inspections.
The very inspections that are prone to the diagnostic errors, the learned errors that LAVES is trying to combat. The small scale reinforces the reliance on older, less precise methods and prevents the adoption of technology that could help overcome those limitations. It's another vicious cycle.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got a sector dominated by small-scale hobbyists, constrained by quality regulations that hinder scaling, and plagued by widespread management errors due to a broken knowledge pipeline.
Not a pretty picture from a business perspective.
And on top of all that internal stuff, there are increasing external pressures making life even harder, especially for anyone trying to make a living from bees.
Absolutely. The operating environment itself is getting tougher, beyond the ever-present biological threat of Varroa, which is a constant cost and management headache even for professionals.
Climate change is hitting hard.
Significantly. Climate instability is becoming a major economic risk factor. Germany is seeing more frequent extreme weather events that directly impact honey production. Think light frosts in spring that damage early fruit blossoms, or prolonged droughts in early summer that scorch the nectar flows from key sources like rapeseed or acacia.
So the honey yields are becoming less reliable, lower overall.
Yes, more volatile and often lower. For a professional beekeeper who needs a certain yield per hive just to break even, this increasing unreliability is a huge challenge. It means the number of colonies they need to manage just to stay afloat keeps going up, simply to buffer against these climate-driven fluctuations.
It's like the baseline for profitability is constantly shifting upwards.
It is, and it demands much greater financial resilience. This is why the source material strongly argues that relying solely on honey production is becoming an economically unsustainable model in Germany, particularly for professionals.
They need to diversify their income streams.
Urgently. If you want profitability in the face of volatile yields and high Varroa costs, you have to move beyond just selling jars of honey.
Which brings us to probably the most critical economic concept in the entire analysis.
The hidden subsidy.
Exactly. The hidden subsidy to German agriculture. This explains, perhaps better than anything else, why professional German beekeeping finds it so incredibly difficult to scale up and become profitable.
Okay, break down this hidden subsidy concept for us. How does it work?
It works like this. Those 1.14 million honeybee colonies across Germany aren't just making honey, they're providing an absolutely essential ecological service pollination.
Right, vital for agriculture.
Crucial. Without adequate managed pollination by honeybees, yields for many high-value crops, think apples, cherries, berries, rapeseed for oil, sunflowers, almonds would plummet. Some estimates suggest yield losses of 30, 50, even 70% or more for certain crops without bees. This service has a massive quantifiable economic value to German farmers and the entire agricultural sector. Billions of euros, potentially. Okay, so pollination is incredibly valuable, but because the vast majority of Germany's bee colonies, maybe 90–95%, are managed by hobbyists.
Who aren't primarily motivated by profit, who keep bees for enjoyment, for the environment, for a bit of honey for themselves.
What happens to the price of that vital pollination service?
It gets provided largely free of charge or at drastically undervalued rates. Those 160,000 plus hobbyists are, in effect, unwittingly subsidizing the entire German agricultural industry. They ensure the crops get pollinated, allowing farmers to achieve high yields, but they don't charge the true commercial value for that service.
Wow. So the farmers get the benefit, higher yields, more profit, without having to properly factor the cost of essential pollination into their business model.
Precisely. It's a massive transfer of value from the beekeeping sector, mostly the non-commercial part, to the agricultural sector. And this creates a huge problem for the professional beekeeper.
Because they need to charge for pollination to be viable, but they can't compete on price.
Exactly. How can a professional who needs to charge, say, 100 or 150 euros per colony to cover their costs and make a profit for providing pollination services to an orchard or a rapeseed field, how can they compete when there's this huge pool of hobbyist hives available locally whose owners might be happy to place their bees there for maybe 20 euros or even for free, just because it's a good spot for their bees to collect nectar?
It completely distorts the market for pollination services.
Fundamentally, it prevents the professional segment from monetizing what should be one of their most stable and valuable income streams. They're perpetually undercut by the free service provided by the hobbyist majority. The whole professional sector is trapped by this structural reality.
To really understand the scale of this missing revenue, we need that comparison point again. The U.S. model, where pollination isn't an afterthought, it's the main event.
Right. The U.S. system is almost the polar opposite in this regard. It's heavily industrialized and built around maximizing pollination revenue.
This is where we hear about bees being trucked all over the country.
Exactly. U.S. commercial beekeepers move millions of hives, often over vast distances, into massive temporary concentrations to pollinate specific crops. The most famous example is the California almond bloom. Something like 2 million hives are needed there every February. But it also applies to apples in Washington, blueberries in Maine, citrus in Florida, vegetables across the country.
And farmers pay for this service.
Oh, absolutely. Pollination fees are a major negotiated part of the agricultural cost structure. It's not a favor, it's a critical input that farmers budget for. For the beekeepers, these pollination contracts provide a significant, often primary income stream that helps stabilize their business against fluctuating honey prices or yields.
Okay, so the U.S. model solves the monetization problem, get paid properly for pollination. But the sources we read included a really stark warning about the cost of that model.
Yes, and this is absolutely crucial. While the U.S. model shows how monetization can work, it also demonstrates the potentially devastating biological consequences of that extreme industrial scale and mobility.
The loss rates.
The loss rates reported by commercial U.S. beekeepers are, frankly, terrifying. Recent surveys, like the one covering June 2024 to February 2025, indicated an average colony loss rate of around 62% over that period.
62% loss in less than a year. That's catastrophic. How is that even sustainable?
The source explicitly labels it completely unsustainable. It means beekeepers are essentially having to replace more than half their entire stock every single year just to stay in business. It's less like managing a livestock population and more like constantly battling a collapsing system.
What drives such horrific losses in the U.S. system?
It's a combination of intense stressors inherent in that industrial model. First, the stress of long-distance transportation itself. Bees are confined, shaken, can overheat or get chilled. Second, nutritional stress. They get put into these vast monocultures like almonds, where there's abundant food for maybe 3 weeks, but then nothing. It's like a feast followed by a famine, lacking the diverse diet bees need. Third, and critically, high pesticide exposure is almost unavoidable in those intensive agricultural landscapes. Neonicotinoids, fungicides, herbicides, they weaken the bees' immune systems, making them far more vulnerable to diseases like nosema, chalk brood, and of course Varroa and the viruses it carries. And fourth, the sheer concentration of millions of hives in one place facilitates rapid disease and parasite transmission.
So just scaling up like the U.S. isn't the answer for Germany if it leads to that kind of biological meltdown.
Absolutely not. Germany needs to learn from the U.S. monetization strategy, getting paid fairly for pollination, but must desperately avoid replicating the U.S. biological risk profile.
So the path forward for German professional beekeeping has to be twofold.
Exactly. First, actively develop and establish formal paid pollination contract models. This needs support, maybe from the government or agricultural associations, to create standard contracts, maybe insurance schemes, and critically, to educate farmers that pollination is a service worth paying a fair price for. End the hidden subsidy.
And
Second, double down on strengthening the biological resilience of the bees themselves. Which brings us back to LAVES Celle and the breeding programs.
like the cellar linny you mentioned.
Yes,
Yeah.
accelerating government support for breeding lines like the cellar linny, which are specifically selected for traits like Varroa resistance or tolerance, is paramount. If you can breed bees that are naturally better at coping with mites, you dramatically reduce the biggest operational cost and risk factor disease management. That's the key to making scaling truly viable and sustainable. Increase income through services and decrease costs and risks through better biology.
Okay, so we've covered the internal structures, the knowledge gaps, the economics. Now we need to turn to another growing area of conflict, the ecological impact.
Right. And this one challenges a really deeply ingrained belief.
The idea that beekeeping is automatically good for nature. Put out more hives, help the environment.
That's the traditional view, yeah. The friendly honeybee as a symbol of a healthy ecosystem. But the source material highlights a growing body of scientific evidence that says, well, it's not that simple, especially under current landscape conditions.
What's the issue?
The issue is direct competition between the domesticated European honeybee, Apis mellifera, and native wild bee species. And this competition is becoming increasingly acute, leading to real political friction with major conservation organizations.
So conservation groups are starting to see the honeybee not as a partner in conservation, but potentially as competition, like an invasive species almost.
Competitive livestock might be a better term they'd use. They see it as a domesticated animal managed by humans, not a wild creature needing protection itself. And the conflict arises from fundamental biological differences between honeybees and most wild bees, especially when resources like pollen and nectar are scarce.
Okay, explain those differences. What makes them competitors?
Well, think about Germany's native wild bees. There are hundreds of different species. Around 90% of them are solitary. They don't live in large colonies. A single female builds her own nest. Crucially, most are central place foragers with a very limited flight range, maybe only a few hundred meters from their
Oh, they
nests.
live very locally.
Very locally. And many are also specialists. Oligolectic is the technical term, meaning they've evolved to feed on the pollen of only one or a few specific types of plants. Their whole life cycle might depend on that one flower blooming.
Biologically quite specialized and maybe fragile then, tied to specific habitats.
Exactly. Now contrast that with our domesticated honeybee, Apis mellifera. It's a super generalist. It'll forage on almost anything that flowers. It flies much longer distances, easily 2 to 5 kilometers, sometimes even up to 10 kilometers from the hive if needed. And most importantly, it lives in massive social colonies, up to 50,000 individuals in a strong hive during peak season. 50,000 highly efficient generalist foragers covering a huge area.
Okay, I can see where this is going. If you have a landscape where intensive agriculture has wiped out most of the general wildflower resources.
Which is sadly the case in many parts of Germany. Lots of monocultures, frequently mown grasslands, fewer hedgerows.
Then the only places left with reliable, diverse flowers might be the protected areas, the nature reserves, maybe some ecologically managed farmland.
Right. These become vital refuges for the specialized short-distance wild bees, but they're also prime locations for beekeepers to place their hives, because that's where the best nectar flows are.
So you drop a few hives, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of super efficient long-range honeybee foragers right into or next to the last remaining food patches for these sensitive wild bees.
And you get intense competition for the limited pollen and nectar. Studies, including ones cited by organizations like the Deutsche Wildtierstiftung, German Wildlife Foundation, confirm this. The sheer density and foraging power of honeybee colonies can overwhelm the local resources, potentially outcompeting native pollinators, especially the specialists.
So the problem isn't honeybees existing. It's the density of honeybees in these critical, resource-limited refuge areas.
That's the key point conservation groups are making, and it's led them to shift from just observing to actively demanding regulations to limit honeybee density, particularly in protected zones.
Groups like NAB, Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union, one of the biggest environmental NGOs in Germany.
Yes. NAB and others are taking a firm stance. Their position is clear. The honeybee is a domesticated utility animal, like a cow or a sheep. It's not a protected wild species itself, therefore its impact on protected wild species needs to be managed.
And what are they demanding specifically?
They're pushing for a nationwide standardized approach. The specific proposal often mentioned is setting a maximum density limit of 3 honeybee colonies per square kilometer within designated nature reserves, or Naturschutzgebiete NSG, and also within a 2-kilometer buffer zone around those reserves.
3 colonies per square kilometer. That sounds incredibly restrictive, especially for a professional beekeeper using mobile operations.
It's extremely restrictive. Think about a professional needing to move, say, 100 or 200 hives to capitalize on a good bloom, like heather or linden trees, which might be located in or near an NSG. A limit of 3 hives per square kilometer makes a kind of commercial exploitation virtually impossible in those prime locations.
So this regulation, if implemented widely, would directly hit the economic viability of large-scale mobile beekeeping, forcing them away from the best forage areas.
Exactly. It potentially restricts access to the most reliable, highest-yielding locations, arguing that native biodiversity protection must take precedence over commercial honey production in these sensitive zones. It pushes professionals back towards relying solely on agricultural landscapes,
which are often lower in floral diversity and might have higher pesticide risks anyway. Another catch-22.
It seems like it. However, the sources also stress something really important here. Even the conservation groups like NABU acknowledge that honeybee competition, while a real localized issue.
Isn't the main driver of wild bee decline?
Yeah, correct. And NABU explicitly states the primary threats to wild bees remain habitat loss due to agriculture, those structure-poor landscapes we talked about, pesticide and fertilizer use, urbanization, soil sealing, and climate change. Honeybee competition is seen as an additional pressure factor in already stressed environments, not the root cause of the crisis.
Okay, that's crucial. It means there's common ground, potentially.
Absolutely. It points towards the only viable long-term solution, an alliance, not a conflict, between beekeepers and conservationists.
An alliance against what? Or for what?
An alliance focused on tackling the shared enemy, destructive agricultural policies and practices. Instead of fighting each other over the scarce resources left in nature reserves, they need to join forces and lobby politically for systemic landscape restoration across the entire countryside.
What would that look like? Mandating flower strips.
Yes, things like mandatory, wide, diverse flowering strips on farmland. Policies that promote crop rotation and diverse landscapes instead of monocultures. Stricter regulations on pesticide use, especially near sensitive habitats. Financial incentives for farmers who create biodiversity-rich areas. Basically, making the whole agricultural landscape more bee-friendly for all bees.
Because if the wider landscape becomes richer in flowers again,
Then the competitive pressure inside the nature reserves automatically decreases. Honeybees would have abundant forage options outside the NSGs, reducing the need for beekeepers to concentrate hives there. And wild bees would benefit enormously from the overall increase in habitat and resources.
so improving the agricultural landscape benefits everyone and diffuses the conflict over density limits in protected areas.
Exactly. The sources argue strongly that focusing solely on regulating honeybee density in NSGs is treating a symptom. The real cure lies in fixing the underlying disease, landscape degradation caused by intensive agriculture. That's the political battleground where beekeepers and conservationists need to find common cause.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've seen this complex picture. A beekeeping sector dominated by hobbyists, held back by traditional regulations like the DIBs, suffering from significant knowledge gaps leading to colony losses, facing economic pressure from climate change and the hidden subsidy, and now even ecological conflict with conservationists.
It's a perfect storm of structural issues, really.
So, based on the analysis in our sources, what are the concrete steps, the actionable recommendations needed to steer German beekeeping towards a more viable, profitable, and sustainable future, especially for the professional segment?
The reform agenda really needs to tackle these issues head-on, starting with acknowledging the dual nature of the sector. You can't apply the same rules or support to a hobbyist with 5 hives and a professional managing 500.
So, step one is clearly defining who's who.
Yes. A clear legal or statistical definition of what constitutes a full-time professional beekeeping operation is needed. The sources often use a threshold like managing over 150 colonies, but the exact number needs discussion. Having this official definition allows the government to design targeted support, financial aid, technical advice, access to specific programs aimed squarely at the scalable professional segment without getting bogged down by the needs of the massive hobbyist base.
Makes sense. Treat the businesses like businesses. What about the DIB paradox, that clash between tradition and scalability?
That needs direct intervention, but carefully. You can't just abolish the Echterdeutscher Honig brand. It has immense value. The suggested solution is a dual brand strategy.
Okay, explain that. Keep the old brand.
Yes, maintain the existing super strict DID standard, the 15 mg/kilogram HMF limit, the mandatory glass for those who want to cater to that premium artisanal regional market that's primarily the hobbyists and smaller direct marketers. Preserve that tradition.
But create a new, parallel standard for professionals.
Exactly. Create a second, distinct, DIB-endorsed quality brand specifically designed for industry compatibility. This parallel brand could have slightly adjusted, but still high quality parameters, maybe an HMF limit of, say, 30 mg/kilograms, which still signifies excellent quality compared to basic EU rules, but allows for efficient processing, like gentle heating and batch mixing.
And crucially, this new brand would allow different packaging.
Absolutely essential. It must permit the use of neutral glass jars of various sizes, potentially even other approved packaging types, allowing professionals to meet the diverse demands of retail chains, food service, and export markets. This gives them the branding and logistical flexibility they desperately need to scale up. It breaks the regulatory trap without destroying the original trademark.
Okay, definition and DIB reform address the structure. What about the knowledge gap, the learned errors? How do you fix the broken pipeline?
This requires a fundamental shift in education. Relying on the Tierwort program alone isn't enough given the numbers, and relying on informal, volunteer-led local training has proven insufficient to ensure scientific best practices are adopted widely.
So, mandatory training.
The sources strongly recommend implementing a mandatory standardized basic beekeeping course for anyone wanting to keep bees in Germany. This isn't about creating bureaucracy, but about ensuring a baseline level of competence.
And this course would have to be based on.
Explicitly based on the current scientific findings and best practices recommended by LAVES Celle. The curriculum needs a relentless focus on the things that matter most for bee health, particularly precise Varroa diagnosis and effective tile treatment protocols. Get the basics right universally. This means standardized teaching materials, possibly certified instructors, ensuring everyone starts with the correct science-backed information, interrupting that cycle of learned errors.
A national standard for basic bee husbandry, essentially.
Yes, an investment in the health of the entire national bee population.
All right, let's talk about the big political and economic levers. Ending that hidden subsidy seems critical.
It's arguably the most important economic reform needed. The state needs to play an active role here. This means actively promoting and facilitating the development of formal, paid pollination contract models.
How could the government help?
They could help develop standardized contract templates that are fair to both farmers and beekeepers. They could offer support for logistics, maybe insurance schemes covering the risks of moving hives for pollination. They could run campaigns to educate the agricultural sector about the real value of managed pollination and why it's a service worth paying a fair market price for. The goal is to make paid pollination a normal, expected part of doing business for professionals, providing that stable income stream they need.
And reinforcing that, the long-term biological solution remains critical.
Always. Continued and accelerated government investment in breeding programs like the Cellerlini at LAVES, focused on Varroa resistance or tolerance, is non-negotiable. This is the ultimate path to reducing management costs, reducing chemical use, and making the entire sector more inherently resilient and sustainable. It's a long game, but vital.
Finally, the sources keep coming back to the idea that the biggest lever isn't actually in beekeeping itself.
No, the most critical lever, the one that addresses the root cause of so many of these problems. Resource scarcity, ecological conflict, even some aspects of bee health lies firmly in agricultural policy.
Fixing the landscape.
Fixing the landscape. The absolute priority needs to be a fundamental shift in agricultural policy towards restoring structural diversity and floral resources across the entire farmed environment. This isn't just about nice-to-have flower strips. It needs to be integrated into core farming regulations.
And mandatory measures.
Things like making diverse, wide flower strips and hedgerows compulsory, not just voluntary. Promoting farming systems that move away from vast monocultures. Implementing much stricter controls on pesticide and fertilizer use, especially creating buffer zones around waterways and sensitive habitats. Policies that financially reward farmers for actively enhancing biodiversity on their land.
Because a richer landscape solves multiple problems at once.
Exactly. It reduces the pressure on bees, both honeybees and wild bees, by providing more abundant and diverse food sources. It alleviates the competition conflict in nature reserves. It likely improves honey yields and bee health overall. It's the systemic solution that benefits beekeepers, conservationists, and ultimately the long-term health of the agricultural system itself. That's where the biggest political push needs to happen. Hashtag tag outro.
So what a journey. We started with that picture-perfect image of the traditional German beekeeper, maybe in lederhosen, tending his hives in a meadow.
A bit of a stereotype, perhaps, but yeah, that idyllic view.
And we've ended up dissecting a really complex, economically challenged industry. It feels caught, doesn't it? Trapped between this intense desire to protect its unique cultural heritage and quality standards, like through the DIB.
And the harsh realities of needing scale, efficiency, and scientific precision to survive in a modern, globalized context, while also facing ecological pressures.
It really highlights how the health and future of German beekeeping aren't just about bees and honey. It's deeply tangled up with regulation, economics, knowledge transfer, and critically, the whole design of the surrounding agricultural landscape.
Absolutely. And that's maybe the key takeaway for you, the listener. Trying to fix beekeeping in isolation, just focusing on better training here or slightly different packaging rules there, it's only ever going to be tinkering around the edges. It might mitigate some symptoms, but it won't solve the underlying structural problem.
Real sustainable change requires looking at the bigger system.
Yes. How Germany manages its farmland, how it values ecological services like pollination, how it balances tradition with the need for economic viability.
Right.
These are the systemic issues that need addressing.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to consider. We talked a lot about those strict DIB quality standards, the low HMF, the specific glass jar. These things really do underpin consumer trust and the premium image of Echte Deutsche Honig. It is special because of those rules.
No doubt about it. That quality guarantee is powerful.
So here's the trade-off to mull over. Is the current structural inefficiency, the difficulty in scaling, the lower profitability for professionals, the vulnerability to learned errors, the hidden subsidy, is that perhaps an unavoidable, maybe even acceptable, cost we pay to preserve that uniquely high artisanal quality standard that defines German honey for so many?
Or, put another way, does Germany have to sacrifice some of that rigid, regional, traditional protectionism if it wants to achieve the kind of economic resilience and professional scale seen in other models, like New Zealand's, minus their potential pitfalls? Can you have both that absolute peak artisanal quality and a thriving, scalable professional sector?
It seems the only way to potentially square that circle is through that major push for landscape reform and ending the hidden subsidy, allowing professionals to thrive economically without necessarily having to compromise the DIB's core brand for those who value it most.
That seems to be the direction the analysis points. Focusing political energy on fixing the agricultural context might be the key to unlocking a better future for both the bees and the beekeepers. Lots to think about there.
A really profound challenge for a practice that feels so simple on the surface. We hope this deep dive into the often hidden complexities of German beekeeping has given you plenty of food for thought. Thanks for joining us.